Hey everybody, CO, and welcome back to Comics and Dragons. I'm Lance White Eagle, and today we're going to be talking about prepping for your first Dungeons and Dragons session, for session 1 of your new adventure. So, the easiest way to do that, especially if you're brand new to DMing, is to go with one of the pre-written adventures. Today we're going to specifically talk about, let me get this box out of the way, the starter set, the 5th edition starter set, because it seems to me the most readily available. Most any game store is going to have that in stock. A lot of comic shops have it. I've seen it in Walmart, I've seen it in Target. So it's all over the place, and it is designed just for this. It is designed for a new DM and new players to get into the game and get going. And as previously mentioned, everything you need is contained in this box to get started. I would suggest picking up an extra set of dice, or your players to pick up their own dice, because you're going to need them. It's really handy for everyone at the table to have their own set. You can share, but it's more convenient to just have them. So the adventure in this is the Lost Mines of Phandelver. And like previously mentioned, if you're going to DM it, read through the whole thing first. It doesn't take all that long to read through it. And you don't have to read through terribly in depth. This is just your first reading of it. And then a day or two later, or the day before you're actually going to play, go back and read the sections that you are going to be DMing that day, so they're fresh. For Lost Mines, I would suggest only preparing the Cragmaw hideout, it's called in this adventure. And it's kind of challenging for low level characters. If you have less than the kind of 4 to 6 intended players, I would suggest taking out one of the monsters from each of the combat encounters, just to make it a little simpler. Low-level characters are squishy. They can easily be brought to 0 hit points, to 0 health. So keep that in mind. Your goal, you want to have fun. This is the first session. You want everybody to go away from it feeling good about the game and wanting to play again. So for Lost Mines, you have a pretty small number of NPCs, non-player characters, in the introduction. There's 2 important ones and maybe 2 others. And it's a good idea to get a piece of paper, get a notebook, and jot those names down for you, just to save you time from flipping back and forth in the book. And that goes with any adventure. Jot down the names of the important NPCs. I forget to do this all the time, and then you're left flipping through pages, which is fine, but it's just more convenient to have them readily available. So for Lost Mines, you're going to go through the first little encounter. You're going to prep the Cragmaw hideout, but chances are you're not probably going to get all the way through the hideout in one session. It kind of depends on what approach the characters take to it. I won't go into too much detail, just in case somebody's watching it who is going to end up playing in it. But there are different scenarios, different ways that each adventure can play out. And some are simpler and take much less time, some are longer. So that's all you really need to prepare. The encounters are already set for you, they're already in there. You just have to read them over. For the Lost Mines, all of the statistics for the creatures that you're going to encounter are in the back of this booklet, of the adventure booklet. So it's all self-contained right there. You don't need any other books necessarily. And that's really it for DMing, for prepping a pre-written adventure. Read through it, refresh yourself on what you're going to be doing for that session, jot down important NPCs. If you are going to do voices or accents, you might want to practice those a little bit. If you're not comfortable with that, you are under no obligation to do silly voices or to do accents. That's a personal preference and is really determined by your comfort level as the dungeon master. No matter what, it's a little intimidating to sit down in front of your friends or family, or especially if it's people you don't know, and run a game. Probably the most common fear people have is public speaking. And that's kind of what DMing is all about, just with a smaller group. So do what you're comfortable with, but keep in mind that you're going to get more comfortable as you go on. Not just long term, not just week to week, but within the session itself, you're going to get more comfortable once things get rolling. So don't put too much pressure on yourself. Don't over prepare. Get some notes. It's always handy to keep a notepad and paper and a writing implement with you behind your Dungeon Master screen or wherever you're DMing, just so you can jot down things as they come up. Players are going to do unexpected things, and it's always good to keep notes, especially if you're going to be continuing on with the adventure in later sessions. Another one that is really good to start out with if you're a new DM is Waterdeep Dragon Heist. It's an adventure for new players. It's very new DM friendly, even though there are a lot of NPCs in here. But you don't have to keep track of all of them all the time. And that's a good one to do. This was the first campaign that one of the new dungeon masters from my group ran, and it was really fun to play in and seemed really DM friendly. However, with the books that are not part of the box sets, you will need other materials to run them. You will need the monster manual and the Dungeon Master's Guide. Now, if you are going to be prepping a session that is entirely of your creation, there's a little more that goes into it. And you're probably going to want more than just the free PDF of the basic rules. You're going to want the core rule books if you're going to be running things that you are making up yourself. And there's a couple of ways you can get those. You can buy them individually. It's the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Monster Manual, and the Player's Handbook. They also have them in sets now. You can get kind of the standard box set, or you can pick one up that has fancier covers. I think this set is... I think it's still available, but it's only available in comic shops or game stores, independent retailers. And those are really kind of necessities if you are going to be creating your own adventures. And you'll want to have each of the pillars of Dungeons and Dragons in that first session. So you're going to want a handful of non-player characters for your players to interact with. You're going to want some shopkeepers, quest givers, community members for them to have exchanges with, because it's a role-playing game. It's not all about the combat. It's about interactions as well. So come up with a handful of NPCs. You don't have to go overboard. I'm starting a new group right now with 3 players, 2 of which have never really played before. So when I was prepping their first session, I had prepared 3 NPCs for them to interact with, and then had kind of in my back pocket a handful of names for possible other NPCs for them to mingle with. And it's always a good idea to have like a list of just random names, either printed out or written down or just in your head, that you can go to and pull somebody out of when you need it. Because you're going to run into a lot of times when your players are going to do something unexpected or want to go somewhere that you haven't thought out. And you're going to want a character to inhabit that, a shop or a blacksmith, so it's a good idea to have those names handy that you can just pick one and go with. You'll also want an exploration aspect of it. So what I do is I get a small scenario, especially for your first session. And if you're not sure it's going to lead into a grand campaign or not, use a simple scenario. And use a cliche. Use a fantasy trope. There's a reason that they're common, is because a lot of them are fun. And it doesn't have to be complicated. Something simple. And your players have never done it before. Even if it's something you've seen 100 times, this particular group of characters have never done it before. So, goblin kidnaps a princess. That's do it. For what I had in mind, the scenario I came up with was a handful of townsfolk went missing. And I just kind of built from there. I decided for the exploration aspect that it was going to be in the sewers, just because it has that kind of dungeon feel. You have intersecting corridors and different pathways that can be chosen. You can set up traps in a sewer system that maybe wouldn't make sense to have a trap if they're just going through a cityscape. So you have social interactions with the NPCs. You have exploration with whatever area you choose to set this in. For mine, it's the sewers. And then you need some combat encounters, which can be the most challenging for a new DM to come up with. And as you go, you'll get more and more comfortable with combat and how to set up scenarios and battles that are level appropriate and of a difficulty that is manageable or challenging or easy. And you want a mix of all of those. and we can all, you're always kind of improving as a DM as you go along. And I have a bad tendency to focus heavily on epic encounters, on the battles that the party's not sure if they're all going to make it through, and they just barely scrape by at the end. And those are exciting. Those can be some of the most exciting battles that you have in Dungeons and Dragons. And afterwards, there's always good conversation about, oh man, that was crazy, and I didn't know, if such and such was gonna make it. And those are fun. And you need those, especially in a longer campaign. You need epic set pieces, but you also need simple encounters. Don't forget that these characters are heroes. They are exceptional individuals. So it's good to have encounters that they can just breeze through. In one of the campaigns I'm running currently online, most of the encounters we've had have been really easy for these characters. But the characters that they're playing are supposed to be highly trained military division. It's set in Eberron, which is like a different D&D setting, and they're veterans of this long-running war. So the early encounters that they've had them go through in this campaign have been not all that challenging for the characters. A couple of them have been harder fights, but most of them have been scenarios where they feel like, yeah, we are good at what we do. So keep that in mind. But for this first session, I decided I wanted to use kobolds. They're a monster in the monster manual. They're a low CR monster. CR stands for challenge rating, and that's how 5th edition determines the difficulty of creatures, is that gives them each a challenge rating, which can be a little wonky sometimes, but for the most part, it's a good system. It's a good basis for how difficult a creature is for a group to overcome. When you're building encounters for your first session, especially if you're unfamiliar with it, in the Dungeon Master's Guide on page 82 is a very handy chart. You're going to want to put a bookmark on this chart just for your personal reference, because as you're getting used to the game, you're going to refer back to that chart over and over and over again. And it's a breakdown of kind of how difficult an encounter is. And to use the chart, what you're going to do is take the number of creatures in the encounter. For the first encounter that these characters went into, and I started them at level 3 because all of the guys who were playing, one of them has played Dungeons and Dragons before, and the other two, even though they haven't played D&D specifically, I assumed were pretty familiar with some of the kind of even mechanics just from things like video games. So we started at level 3, which made it a little easier to encounter build because they're not so delicate as a level 1 character. But level 3 is still, their health is pretty low. So for the first encounter, I used 4 kobolds. We had 3 player characters, so I had 3 standard kobolds and a kobold sorcerer, which is not in the monster manual, is in one of the other books. I think it's Volo's Guide to Monsters. The monster manual, one of the core books here, is really all you need to run Dungeons and Dragons forever. There are hundreds of different creatures in here to choose from. So you don't really need the supplemental things. The 3 core rule books, you're good to go for years and years and years. The other stuff is just if you want to add on to it. But they fought these little kobold, these little like lizard goblin creatures. And the first encounter was set up to be fairly easy for the most part. The standard kobolds did not last past the first round of combat. And that's kind of important. You know, they felt like, oh man, we rocked those guys. The sorcerer lasted a little bit longer, just to kind of show, to give a balance of the different kind of creatures that you're going to encounter. So for this session, prep that first encounter, use the chart, which, you know, you take the experience points for all of the creatures in the encounter, add it together, divide it by the number of players you have, and then that number you can reference on the chart on page 82 in the DMG of how difficult the encounter is going to be. And yeah, I know it doesn't sound super exciting. Sometimes DMing is math. But it is fun, and you should enjoy being the dungeon master. It's supposed to be fun for you too. So for this first session, for me personally, I prepped 3 combat encounters. The first one, pretty simple. I knew that the players most likely weren't going to get too damaged, but they took enough that I do believe, if I'm remembering correctly, they took a short rest afterwards, which you should have that opportunity built into your session. A short rest is generally, I think it's like an hour in the DMG. I'm not sure because and like it talks about in the books of Dungeons and Dragons, it makes implicitly clear that these are guides. These are suggestions. It could be that standard short rest is like 4 hours, but in my campaigns, it's an hour. And I'm not sure which is the real rule and which is my rule, because that's the way we've been doing it since we started. So, and that's the way it should be. That's the way it's kind of designed to be. So I always built in somewhere where it is okay to take a short rest, especially when they're low levels, because you don't want to kill off players in the first session. If that's the style of game you're running, that's fine. But if you're new and your players are new, I would suggest not killing them in your first session, because they're not going to want to come back. It's not going to be fun for them. So, had our first encounter, had a rest. That way I could also explain the rest mechanics. Then had another combat encounter, a kind of short one. One adversary that was kind of on the move and running from them and kind of attacking and fleeing after each attack, just to kind of give a different feel for the encounter. I also threw some traps in there, because kobolds, in their kind of story for Dungeons and Dragons, they're trap makers. And also to kind of get the players accustomed to that idea that it's not always safe just to walk down the corridor. Sometimes you should be checking for what's there. And to finish up the session, we had kind of a boss battle, a dungeon boss. And in the terminology, anytime it's a sewer system, a cavern, a fortress, anything, it's referred to as a dungeon, just in game terms. So the boss of this dungeon was an orc, just because I was flipping through and I was like, oh, yeah, I haven't used orcs in a while. They're some of them are low challenge rating creatures, and that'd be good for a mini boss to this first session. And I made him much more difficult than the other encounters that they had already been through, because this was kind of their challenge. This was to get to the next stage. You have to beat the baddie, and he was more difficult, but hopefully not frustratingly so to the players. It was a longer battle than the previous ones had been, and one of the players did go unconscious, did drop to 0 hit points. In 5th edition, that's not death. That just means your guy got knocked out temporarily. The other player brought him back up immediately, healed him, and the battle continued. They defeated the orc and they freed the townsfolk. And that was it. It was a simple session. It took the entire evening. Part of that was because we were building characters beforehand, which does take some time, especially when you're new. And that was our adventure. They seemed to really enjoy it. They seemed to be excited to launch into a whole campaign and do a long-term scenario with these characters. And that's really what you want to get out of your first session. So kind of to sum up, for your first session, if you're creating it yourself, you want to have, and especially this is primarily if you have new players, introduce all the kind of core aspects of the game. Have social interaction, have some exploration, have some combat. Make sure it's not too difficult, but not too easy at the same time. You want challenges, and you want success, and that's really what you're going for. Get your handful of NPCs, find a monster that looks cool and that's level appropriate, and if you want, just Google maps. Google Dungeons and Dragons maps. If you don't want to go and plot out your own area to explore, find a map and just use it. Use it and change the things in it. Go to one of the pre-written adventures and use a map from there. I've done that quite a bit. Even if I'm not running the adventure, if I need a temple or a castle or something, and I don't want to take the time to go through and plot it all out myself, I'll flip through the books and find something similar and just use that map and just add in whatever makes sense for the scenario that I'm running at the time. And most important, remember to have fun. You're supposed to have fun as the DM. The players are supposed to have fun. You want people to go away from the first session feeling excited about what's going to happen next. And that's really it. Encounter building takes time to get used to. Use the charts, use the suggestions until you get comfortable with just making them. And the only other suggestion that I probably would have is, like, if you're doing the Lost Mines, if you're doing the starter set, and you find that an encounter is too challenging, you can change it right then and there. And you can change it in simple ways. Like this first scenario, the first combat that you have in the Lost Mines involves goblins, and they're using short bows, and they do a d6 damage, and you have level 1 characters. If you have a wizard or something like that, one arrow can put them unconscious. So if you find that, you know, you've done one round of combat and it looks like it's going to be trouble for your characters, it is perfectly fine to be to say, you know, that goblin only had one arrow that he had scavenged from somewhere. So get rid of the short bow, and he's going to attack with a dagger, which does a d4 instead of a d6. And that's kind of one of the things that you'll get more used to as you go on, is adapting on the fly to difficulties and to suit your players and your particular scenario and play style. But I think that's about it. If you have any specific questions, make sure to leave them in the comments below, and I'll see if I can help you out. And while you're down there, like, share, subscribe, hit the little bell if you want notified of new videos, which are going to get back on track. We're going to get back on putting out videos regularly. So until next time, happy trails, and thank you for watching Comics and Dragons.